Okay, we're ready for sheepbrain dissection. And before we start, we have to make sure we have our PPE. First one, you have your lab coat, and then you have your gloves, and then you need your goggles. Why is that? Because the sheepbrain was preserved in formalin, and formalin is a very toxic liquid. If that liquid happen to get into your eyes, it's going to damage your eyes. So better have your goggles on. Now we have our tools ready, and we have our lab menu, and then we're gonna get a brain into this tree, and we're ready to start. Okay, let's go ahead and start. I have 3 sheep brains here. So first one, we need to identify the orientation of the brain. First one is the dorsal and ventral. So the dorsal is the back side of the brain. This is the dorsal, and the ventral is the belly side of the brain. So there are some more structures on the ventral side of the brain, right? So dorsal and ventral. Anterior and posterior. So anterior is the front, right? Okay, so for this brain, this is the front and this is the back. So it's the posterior. How do I know that? Because this little guy here, that's the spinal cord, and that's the posterior, the back side of the brain. And this is the front. You have one of the olfactory bulb here, so that's the anterior part. So that's where the nose goes. So it's also called the rostral, and then the posterior is also called caudal. Okay, and next one is the medial and lateral. That's easy. So the medial is the center, lateral is the side. So that's the lateral. Okay, and next one, coronal and sagittal. So coronal, if I cut a brain like this, I'm going to get a bunch of coronal sections, right? So that's coronal, separate the brain back and the front. And then the sagittal means I cut the brain this way. That will separate the brain left and right. So this is the orientation of the brain. So next one, I need to peel out the meninges. You see this look like plastic structure here, the membrane, that is a meninge. There are 3 layers of them, but we cannot see all the 3 layers on the sheep brain. We can only see the tough matter, the dura mater, right? So that's the dura mater. Underneath that, there is a arachnoid, there's a pia. They're so thin that we can't even peel them out from the brain, but they're there. All right, and before we cut it, we want to take a look at structures on the ventral side. So this is the ventral view of this brain that look a little bit messy here. Let's take a look at another brain here. Okay, see this one look a little bit better. So you see this round structure, shiny ball look like structure that look like a tumor, right? Is the brain, this sheep brain has a tumor? That's a good question. Let's take a look. And this one also have a tumor structure, but some of the tissue get cut, so it's not as shiny as the other one. So what is that structure? That is the pituitary. Okay, that's not a tumor, that's a pituitary. So this guy here, that's a pituitary. Okay, now we need to use a dissecting scissor to make an opening of the meninge and cut through and get rid of the meninges. So this is a dissecting tumor. This is a dissecting scissor. Now let's cut the meninges, and we want to preserve the optic chiasm. So this is the optic chiasm. Eventually, this nerve will go into the eyes, right? Sticking out from the brain. So this is the X shape. Chi means X, so that's X shape chiasm. Now we're gonna cut the meninges. And we'll have to be careful to preserve the olfactory bulb, which is here. Look, ooh, that look like an egg yolk, yummy. And the other one is here, so we have to preserve them. Okay, so now I'm gonna cut the meninges out. So there's very, very thin membranes lays on the brain. That's where the, let me see if I can poke it. Oh, that's very, very thin. I can't even. I'm gonna see there's shiny structures. That's the arachnoid and dura and the pia mater. I'm gonna poke the brain. See here. Okay, that is the arachnoid and pia. Okay, I'm gonna continue cut. Alright, and I need to cut that thing too. So there is a piece of hard meninges. I need to go in there and keep cutting, and I will be able to peel it out. Alright. Whoa, look at that. Oh, that feels so good. That feels so good. And keep cutting. Oh, I love it. See that? It's very loosely. Take a look of the stringy thing. That's actually the cranial nerves that's generated from the brain and go through the meninges and sticking out to the brain. So that's the cranial nerves. Okay, now I'm going to peel that. Okay, if you take a look underneath the pituitary, all right, you see the pituitary is actually connected to the brain through a very, very small stalk. This is the pituitary stalk, also called the infundibulum. Now I'm going to remove the pituitary and all the other tissues here. Okay. If I flip that open, you see there's the stalk here, and this part, the stalk that's connected to the pituitary. All right. So I left the piece of meninges wrapping around the optic chiasm because I don't want to cut the optic chiasm. Okay, so now this brain is naked. Let's take a look, a closer look of the brain. So let's take a look at the ventral side. So first one, we need to see the olfactory bulb. So that is here. Look, it's separate from the brain actually. So olfactory bulb, right? And then we need to see the optic chiasm. So this is the optic chiasm. Look, it's an X-shaped structure, right? So you can see underneath the meninges. Okay, now we need to identify structures on the dorsal side of the brain. So I'm going to lay the brain on their belly. So first one, cerebrum. So the cerebrum has two hemispheres. And then the sulci and gyri. So sulci is the plural form for sulcus, right? So sulcus sync. So see this darker color thing here? That is sulci. And then the gyri race, right? So this is a gyrus. And the plural is gyri. All right, and then the cerebellum. So the cerebellum's here. So the function of the cerebellum is to balance, right? Cere has a good balance, and it also have two hemispheres. And the middle, we call them the vermis. And why it's called the vermis? Because that looks like a worm laying in here. So the function for the vermis is connecting the left and right hemisphere of the cerebellum. Okay, so next, let's label the lobes. First one is a frontal lobe. Okay, of course, frontal lobe is the front part, right? So you see there is a sulcus that separates this lobe from this lobe, and that is a frontal lobe. We'll pin the frontal lobe. So there's a frontal lobe. And then the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is posteriorly to the frontal lobe. So this is the parietal lobe. And then the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is where pretty far behind here. So this is the occipital lobe. And then the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is something very close to your ear. So this roughly region here, temporal lobe. And then central sulcus. So the central sulcus is the sulcus that separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So for sheep brain, that's not very dramatic, but you can still see kind of a separation, the central sulcus here. For human brain, that's more dramatic. So I'm going to put a pin in here, the central sulcus. And because that's a sulcus, sulcus is a valley, so that's actually a space. It's not that deep, but it's still space. That's a space separate the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Next one, the longitudinal fissure. It's also a space that is this big, long, deeper thing here. So remember, fissure is another word for sulcus. It's just deeper. So this is a longitudinal fissure. that separate the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Okay, then the last one is the renal sulcus for this step. So renal sulcus is something in here. First one is a sulcus, right? Second is in the temporal lobe. So this is the renal sulcus. You see there's a dent here. That's a renal sulcus. And why it's called the renal sulcus? Renal means nose, right? Because that storage a lot of information from the smell. So a lot of nerve from the olfactory bulb go along here and then end it here. So that is the smell center. Okay. Next step, we need to take a closer look at the ventral side of the brain. So first one, we need to label the olfactory bulb, which is this yellow thing here, right? So olfactory bulb, and then the olfactory tract. So after the olfactory bulb, there is a structure goes along the brain. See here? That is olfactory tract. I'm going to label that. That's olfactory tract. And next one, infundibulum. It's also called pituitary stalk. Okay, so here is the pituitary stalk was located. See, there's actually a hole in here. If I keep poking, you can see there's a hole here. And why there's a hole here? Because the hormone that's secreted by hypothalamus will go to the pituitary through this hole. Actually, I'm going to show you the infundibulum on this brain. That's a little bit more clear. So you see the hole here? That is the pituitary stalk. That's a hollow structure. All right. Okay, next one. I'm gonna label that the pituitary stalk, the infundibulum. Okay, and next one is the periamygdaloid cortex. So what does that mean? That's a long word. So first one, peri means around. Amygdaloid means something related to amygdala, and cortex means the outer part of the brain, right? So that is somewhere in here. So that's the cortex part. Here, and inside this cortex you have the amygdala. So I'm going to pin that here. So periamygdaloid cortex. And if you still remember, we have this sulcus here, and that is the renal sulcus, right? Okay, and next one, the optic chiasm, which is pretty clear. This is the X here. That is optic chiasm. And optic chiasm is anterior to the infundibulum, to the pituitary stalk, right? Okay, and then the last one is the mammillary body. So the mammillary body is posteriorly to the infundibulum, the pituitary stalk. So there's a little bit membrane, meninges, the leftover meninges, the pia and the arachnoid. So I'm going to separate that, and you can see that. So that's the mammillary body. Okay, now pin that. Okay, so next one, we need to cut the brain half and half with a mid-sagittal section. So let's cut the brain half and half. Okay, on this half of the brain, we need to identify structures on the mid-sagittal plane. So first one is the cerebellum. That's easy, right? So this big guy here, that is the cerebellum. Cere has good balance. Cerebellum is responsible for balance. And then the pineal gland. That is actually a very small piece of gland in here. You see here? It's connecting to the brain, but it's very small. It's the individual structure. This structure will secrete melatonin and put you asleep. Okay? And because that's very small, this part of the brain, we only have a very even smaller piece. So the majority part of the pineal gland is on this half. Boing, boing. Okay, pineal gland. Superior colliculus. That is somewhere more posteriorly to the pituitary gland, right? So there's connections, connective tissue. I move them. This is the superior colliculus. That's the center for eye movement. So you move your eyeballs up and down, left and right. This is the control center. So superior colliculus. And then the next one is the lateral ventricle. Okay, so the lateral ventricle is here. And you see there's a membrane covering it. If I cut the membrane, you will see there's a hollow structure underneath that. And cut the membrane. And keep separate. And we're going to see a bigger hole here. Whoa, look at that. Whoa, a whole new world. Okay, so that's the lateral ventricle. And inside the lateral ventricle, you'll find something here. Something like this. Ew, what is that? That is a blood vessel. Why you have blood vessel inside the lateral ventricle? Because that is how the CSF get into the lateral ventricle. So CSF is basically the plasma get out from your blood vessel and that diffuse into the space. The lateral ventricle, you have the CSF. Oh, I need to pin that. So that is lateral ventricle. Yeah, it's a space, right? You're supposed to have CSF in there when the sheep was alive. Next one. The fornix. Okay, so the fornix is something underneath the lateral ventricle. Okay, and next one, hippocampus. So the hippocampus, from this view, we only see a very small structure. So this roundish structure here, that's a hippocampus. We don't see much of that. Actually, hippocampus is a big structure, but we can't see much on the mid-sagittal view. Okay, next one, mammillary body. All right, we already see them earlier on the ventral view. You have the optic chiasm, and then the infundibulum, which is the pituitary stalk, and posteriorly to that, that's the mammillary body, right? So it's here, and from the side view, it looks like this. And next one, hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is something connect the thalamus and the pituitary. So this is the thalamus, and somewhere in here, that's the hypothalamus. It's hard to see a distinct structure of that, but that's in between the infundibulum, which is the pituitary stalk, and the thalamus. So somewhere in here, that is the hypothalamus. Hypo means underneath, so hypothalamus. So next one is anterior commissure. So anterior commissure is something somewhere in here. It's above the optic chiasm in here. It's not distinct, but roughly we can tell a region of that. So anterior commissure. So commissure means crossing. So this structure is also connecting left and right brains. All right, next one. Corpus callosum. Okay, so the corpus callosum is something above the lateral ventricle. So here's the lateral ventricle that we saw earlier. So this is the corpus callosum. You see that's a very long structure, goes all the way from here to here. So the corpus callosum, and that is a little bit lighter color because that's white matter. So corpus callosum. Okay, and next one, the pons. So the pons is somewhere in here. See that bumpy structure here, and probably gonna see a little bit better view in here. So this is the pons, and from the side view, it's a little. You can see a rough edge of the pons. So this is the pons. I'm gonna put a pin here. That's the pons, and then the thalamus. So this is the structure, the round structure of the thalamus on this brain. And we can have another one, the thalamus is here. Okay. Actually, you can see the pons better on the ventral view of the intact brain. So you see there is this round structure here and round structure here. These are the pons. And the brownish coloring here, that is a blood vessel. So I can remove that. And you see the pons a little bit better. So this is the pons. Okay, and then the whole thing in here, that is a medulla oblongata. Okay, so this whole thing here. If somebody poke your medulla oblongata, guess what? You did. Because this thing controls your heart rate, controls your breath, all these vital important functions. Okay, so next one. We need to make some coronal sections. Okay, so how do we make coronal sections? We're going to use half of the brain and place the brain with their mid-sagittal plane facing downward, okay, like this. And then we need to locate the periamygdala. If you remember, this is the periamygdala cortex here, right? And if you still remember, we have a sulcus, that's a renal sulcus. That's where the olfactory bulb, olfactory tract, and goes to the renal sulcus. That's your smell information source here, okay? And next one, we need to cut everything anterior to this periamygdala thing away. So I'm going to start to cut. So anything above, anterior to that, we're going to cut that away. Okay, so that's, we don't need that. Okay, and then I'm going to remove this thing for now. And then we're going to place a ruler by the ventral side of the brain. You remember this is the ventral side, right? And I need to make half centimeter cut. So on this ruler, this side is inches and this side is centimeter. So I need to cut half centimeter 3 slices. So let's go ahead and start. All right. And then the posterior part, we don't need that either. So let's take a look of these 3 slides. So this one is the most most anterior one, right? And this is the most posterior one because we just cut this way, right? Okay, now let's place, in the line manual I said place a Rosso slice away from you. This is away from you. And for each slice, you have to place the ventral side closer to you. So this is the ventral side. Why? How can I tell? Because there are more textures in here. This is a cortex, and this one don't have much structure. That's the ventral side of the brain. So we need to place the ventral side closer to you, and this is the ventral side too, right? See, there is a big, very uniform structure, and that's the ventral side. And see, there's a texture. That's a cortex. That's the dorsal side. Okay, so this is the most anterior slice, and this is the dorsal side of the slide. This is the ventral side. Same thing, dorsal side, ventral side, and this is the last slice. Okay, so next thing, we need to match the slice with our plate in the lab menu. So first one, we want to find one that looks like the plate number 13. I think this one looks like number 13 a lot because first one, you have this small piece of structure here and you have holes underneath and then the holes are above. And this one looks number 14 a lot because you have this long structure in here that you can find it number 14 and you have this big chunky structure now because all the structures we need to identify are on these 2 plates. So I'm going to leave that thing aside. So let's start to label the structures on these 2 pieces of coronal sections. First one, the third ventricle. So on plate 13, your third ventricle is in here, right? In here. So I'm going to label that the third ventricle. And then we have the amygdala. So we also find the amygdala on the plate number 13, and that is this structure here. All right? And then next one, thalamus. So thalamus is this big chunky stuff. You can find the plate 13 and the plate 14 on your lab menu. So that's also the thalamus. So we can label that. I'm going to unpin these things to reuse the pins. So these are the thalamus. All right, next one, hypothalamus. So hypo means underneath, right? So underneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus. It's somewhere in here. That's not distinct structure, but the roughly that's underneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus, right? And then corpus callosum. So on both number 13 and 14 plate on your lab menu, we have corpus callosum. It is this guy here. See, that's white structure here. That's corpus callosum. And this guy here, the white structure here, that's corpus callosum too. Lateral ventricles. So the lateral ventricles, you can find both on number 13 and 14. So this spacing here. Underneath the corpus callosum, you see the blood vessels, right? So that's the lateral ventricle. And on plate number 14, you also have lateral ventricle. See, that's lateral ventricle here. And put a pin in here. That's lateral ventricle and lateral ventricle. Next one, hippocampus. So hippocampus is a really long structure, but on this plate, you only see one piece of that. So that's the hippocampus. I'm gonna pin that. It's the hippocampus. On this one, you see a bigger hippocampus. So from here, go all the way around here. See that? You can separate them out. So that's a very distinct structure by itself. That is the hippocampus. Pineal gland. If we are lucky, we can still find the pineal gland on here. If not, that's probably on the other side of the slides. Okay, actually, the pineal gland is on the third slice that we made. It is here. Okay, so this one is posteriorly to this one. You see the hippocampus is still here. So originally they were like this, right? And then the pineal gland is somewhere in here. Okay, so that is for this step. And then next one, the last step. We need to trim a half brain so we can expose the superior colliculus, hippocampus, thalamus, and then we need to dissect out the hippocampus. So if you remember, we identify the hippocampus from the mid-sagittal view. It's a very small structure, it's here. And if you remember, this is a corpus callosum, right? And that is a fornix. So this part of thing is the top of the hippocampus. And then what is this little guy here? If you remember, that is a pineal gland. Okay, so we need to cut things above the hippocampus. So it'll be safer. I'm going to start to cut things above the corpus callosum. So I'm going to cut from here. Okay, I'm going to cut more. Okay, now I see something very cool. Look at that. There is a round structure, that's a hippocampus. So the hippocampus goes start from here and then wrap around the brain. Okay, I'm gonna dissect all the tissues out for you. Okay, now I expose a majority part of the hippocampus. You see that? See that hippocampus wrap around the brain. And from the mid-sagittal view, early on you only see a very small part of the hippocampus in here. And underneath that, that's your pineal gland. Okay, so if I separate the hippocampus, you're gonna feel like a cap. So see that? That feels very good. It's the cap, right? If you flip that over, you see this round structure here. That's actually the thalamus. And what is the function of the thalamus? That is the post office, is that right? That's the relay center. So from the mid-sagittal view, you see the thalamus is like this. It goes around and it's a bumpy structure. Pin that. Thalamus. And then you can see there's a structure here. This is superior colliculus. That's the eye movement center, right? And this is the pineal gland. So superior colliculus. Okay, now the last step. I'm going to peel the hippocampus out. So I remove the piece of hippocampus. So if you need to dissect the hippocampus out, that's how you do it. All right, and that's it for the dissecting of the sheep brain. So the last thing we need to do is to clean up our mess. Look how messy they are. Oh my God. Okay, so all these brain tissues has to go to chemical solid waste, because these brains were preserved in formalin. It smells really bad first of all, and second, formalin is a very toxic chemical. You don't want to throw these things in regular trash to damage our environment.